I'm back with Rebekah Koffler, Russian-born U.S. intelligence expert, author of the book Putin's Playbook. Rebekah, you were talking in the last segment about an irony, which is that you've got all these U.S. intelligence experts, and they seem to be participating in a scheme in America to contract and repress liberty, certainly to oppose truth from coming out. Sometimes they deploy their power to go after political opponents. They're deploying these kind of socialist tactics in America and that are undermining, as you say, democracy. And at the same time, their rhetoric is consistently one of promoting democracy abroad. In fact, this is their whole justification for trying to mobilize a global campaign on behalf of Ukraine. We got to protect democracy against authoritarianism. What do you think is the actual agenda of these guys? Normally, when I find that people are acting in a double standard, there's some single standard hiding behind the double standard. So what's the single standard? What's the agenda of these guys in promoting, let's call it authoritarianism at home, freedom abroad?
I'm actually just as stunned as you, Dinesh. It is a mystery to me what these people are up to, because it is really not only ironic, but it is scary that they are talking about promoting democracy in every nook and cranny of the world, even willing to go to war over it, sacrifice thousands of lives of American servicemen and women, the real patriots. You know, these are the people in the Washington establishment who make decisions that affect people's lives. And yet they're willing to suppress democracy here. I do not know. I'm at a loss, Dinesh. All I know is that this needs to stop, and we need to expose these people. These 50 people need to really lose their security clearances right now. And anyone who suppressed alternative analytic view, whether it's COVID, whether it's the Russian interference in 2016 election, they need to be fired right now.
Rebekah, where do you think this Ukraine war is going? And I mean, I'm assuming you agree with me that some of this attempt to cancel Russia, in other words, block Russian banking from going on and make sure that the Russian singer at the Met is not allowed to perform, or all this kind of stuff. I'm assuming that Putin's not going to be particularly fazed by any of this. Now, he might be a little more phased. We talked about this last time by the campaign against the Russian oligarchs. That might actually hit a little bit closer to home. But do you think that his goal is to level Ukraine and take it over? Or do you think he wants to bring the Ukrainian government into a position of abject submission to Russia, in which Ukraine would remain quasi-independent, but nevertheless, it will do Russia's bidding going forward?
So remember how this war started. Dinesh, Putin stated several times that Ukraine's potential membership in NATO was a red line. The reason it is a red line for Putin is because NATO is a military alliance, which specifically was created to counter the Soviet Union. And so the distance right now between NATO forces and St. Petersburg, which is the second largest city in Russia, has reduced from the Cold War to today from 1,000 miles to 100 miles, okay? Putin wants to enforce his version of the Monroe Doctrine. He believes that is part of his vital interests. The strategic security perimeter, it is true that Russia has relied on that strategic buffer zone for centuries for wars, and most wars have come from the West, right? So that's a pure military calculation. So right now, even though tactically the Russians have performed horribly, miserably, it's embarrassing. So Putin's strategic plan has not survived contact with the adversary. He has achieved and is achieving his strategic goal, which is to prevent Ukraine from becoming part of NATO. Why? It's because so long as Ukraine remains in active conflict And so long as there's no territorial integrity and sovereignty, it can become part of NATO. Okay. Second, the several Ukrainian cities have just been obliterated. Foreign investment is not flowing in Ukraine. Ukraine has been destroyed both physically and economically. And that just suits fine for Putin. And so this is a very, very long game. It's not going to end anytime soon, not in a month, not in 2 months. He's in it for a very, very long haul.
Rebekah, you just said something to me that's very fascinating, which is that, you would hardly be accused of being a Putin apologist. You are, in fact, your book is a kind of scorched earth expose of Putin and the bandits around him. And yet, you made a point that anyone who takes a kind of, let's call it America first way of thinking about the world, we have to say that if we think about American interests, and of course, America came up with the Monroe Doctrine, just as you said, in order to protect its own backyard, that there is an element of rationale in what Putin is saying when he says, in effect, I need to protect my backyard. I don't like the idea of NATO troops breathing down my neck 100 miles away from St. Petersburg any more than you would if the situations were reversed. Do you think that, in fairness, that the West has been a little dismissive of Russia's legitimate security concerns? And in that sense, did the West, through its own recklessness, obviously Putin's doing it. We're not trying to say that the West is doing it, but did the West contribute to this? This is kind of Mearsheimer's point in a realist analysis of the situation. And is there the case that the Biden administration and the West does bear a little bit of the blame here?
So I 100% agree with John Mearsheimer. In fact, this is a highly intelligent person. He's a West Point graduate, right? But look, nobody invites John Mearsheimer to speak on TV, even on regular networks that are conservative leaning, because his version of events, like the reality that he's describing to us, realpolitik, right, which drives every single statesman, real statesman, right, whether not just authoritarians. So he describes that how it is. So here's the crux of the matter, Dinesh. We have refused to acknowledge that Putin has legitimate security concerns, and we pretend that those don't exist, but they do exist. And the longer we are going to deny that reality, we are not going to be able to predict how far Putin is going to go in order to defend his perceived security concerns and his perceived sphere of influence. And we also are going to underestimate what he can potentially do. And what he can potentially do, and I've said it many times, and this is why in some quarters I'm no longer invited, is because I talk realistically. I provide sober intelligence analysis instead of making people feel good. He may use tactical nuclear weapons to de-escalate conflict in Ukraine and to achieve victory that he believes is very important for him to achieve.
Rebekah, that's very sobering analysis. I'm assuming it applies not just to Putin, but also to the way we understand China. As you say, all countries in the world operate in their own self-interest. And so this kind of analytical playbook is absolutely vital. Folks, I recommend Putin's Playbook by Rebekah Koffler. Rebekah, thanks so much for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Dinesh. Very, very nice to be here with you and your audience.